Hi, and welcome back to the Extreme Hangout, to everybody here in our audience in Glasgow, and to you all watching around the world. This next panel discussion is about mobilizing communities. We all know the effects of climate change have not been borne equally. Ending the climate crisis is as much about halting global emissions as it is about ensuring justice for its victims. I would like to invite all of you to warmly welcome to the stage our moderator, Majid, and his fantastic panel, who I'm going to allow him to introduce, or indeed themselves, for them to introduce themselves to you. But please, ladies and gentlemen, let's put our hands together and give them all a very warm welcome.
Right, good. Mic check, mic check. Thank you very much, tech people. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a real privilege to be joining here today. A very brief introduction. My name is Majid, founder and director of Union of Justice, which is a European independent people of color-led organization that's dedicated to racial injustice and climate justice. And formerly Lord Mayor of Sheffield and formerly a member of European Parliament, representing God's own country of Yorkshire and the Humber. For those, do I have any people from Yorkshire? No, I'll take that as a pass. But I'm sure they're all online. We're very internety people in Yorkshire. But basically, yeah, as we know, like as the lady basically just kind of touched upon, it's the fight for climate justice is the fight of all our lives. However, the effects of the climate crisis is massively unequal and unfair. It was something that was created by the privileged few, but it is sadly hitting marginalised communities the most. And I guess without some sort of radical and rapid change, of course, this kind of unjust trend really could add itself to the profound historic injustices women, people of colour and marginalised communities already face, whether that be here in the UK or across the world. And I guess one of the ways in tackling this is mobilising communities. And to explore this and so much more, I'm really privileged to be joined by three amazing guest speakers in Clover Hogan, Marinelle Lobaldo and Forrest. So please join me in giving them all a massive round of applause. So, and I'm going to get you guys to introduce yourselves. So I'll start off with you, Grace.
Good morning. Thank you all so much for coming down. My name is Forrest. I'm Australian. I'm the co-founder and director of Walk Free, which is an international human rights group focused on the eradication of modern slavery in all its forms. I'm also a UN Goodwill Ambassador for Australia, and I think important to this conversation as well, I'm a director of the Centre for Humanitarian Dialogue, which is a conflict mediation group. So compounding crisis is what I'll be talking about today.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Clover.
It's not often that you get two Aussies on a panel together, so this is quite cool. My name is Clover Hogan. I'm a 22-year-old climate activist and the founder and executive director of Force of Nature. We're a global youth nonprofit that works to mobilize mindsets for climate action. So we recognize that the threat, even greater than the climate crisis, is how powerless so many of us feel in the face of it. So everything that we do is really around harnessing difficult climate emotions like eco-anxiety, which we'll talk about today, into action.
Fantastic, thank you. And last but not least, Marinelle.
Hello everybody, I'm Marinelle Lobaldo. I come from the Philippines and I became a climate justice advocate after surviving Super Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines, where we have lost lives, we have lost so many relatives and friends. And it was like the turning point of my life that climate justice advocacy has become really personal for me, because I want to give justice to those who have perished, to those who are not here now, to share their story because they are dead now. And we don't want to lose more lives because of climatic disaster. That is why I'm here sharing my story and my community's story, because we want to put a human face to the climate crisis. I'm also an ecological justice advocacy officer for Living Laudato Si Philippines, and our organization was the first organization who first organized the climate strike in Eastern Visayas in Philippines. And we lobby with the government, with our organization, the Youth Leaders for Environmental Organization. We work with communities and lobby with the government.
Fantastic, thank you very much. Just to kind of kick things off, I'd love to kind of ask you all the same question, which is, I guess, as well as an environmental problem, the climate crisis is also a social and economic and political problem. So I guess in your experience and line of work, how is the climate crisis linked to gender and racial inequality?
The two are intrinsically linked, and I think that as long as we are having conversations or global conferences like this where issues are treated in isolation, we're going to fail at both. The climate crisis is a humanitarian crisis. The climate crisis is a crisis of accountability. The climate crisis is created by a system that was built for convenience at the benefit of some, for the great cost of others, and certainly our natural environment. And I think in the last 18 months, we've heard over and over that the system is broken in the wake of COVID-19, but it's very much not broken. It's working like a Swiss clock, the way it was built to be. And in the context of modern slavery, which we use as an umbrella term to describe a number of highly exploitative practices, including forced labour, forced marriage, debt bondage, and state-imposed forced labour, we know that there are actually more people living in slavery today than any other time in human history. 1 in every 200 people on Earth. And if you're a woman or a girl, that vulnerability goes up exponentially, finding that 1 in every 130 women and girls on Earth is living in modern slavery. That number is taken from a pre-COVID-19 global estimate, so it is undoubtedly conservative. And I think my last point on this is that this exploitation is not an abstract concept. It's not far away. Modern slavery exists in this country. It exists in every country, but it underpins our global economy. And the exploitation of women and girls could literally be as close as the shirt on your back. The fashion industry is the second dirtiest industry on Earth. It is a greater climate polluter than shipping and aviation combined. It's not a coincidence that it is also the second greatest contributor to modern slavery. It is a deeply exploitative and extractive industry, and from cotton to the manufacturing to where things are sold, we know 1 in 5 cotton garments on Earth are coming out of Xinjiang right now. So unless a business can tell you what they are proactively doing for both people and planet together, please assume they have modern slavery in their supply chain, because I promise you they do.
Brilliant, thank you very much. And same question to you, Marinelle, like how is, I guess in your line of work, your experience working in the Philippines, how is the climate crisis linked to kind of gender and racial inequality?
Well, I will. That's a really good fact there. I will now share about my experience. Whenever there is a disaster, not just actually typhoons, whenever there is a disaster, it is always the girls who is the number one, the first who will drop out of school. Why? Because their family have to send them to big cities to work as sales ladies, as maids. They have to help their families back home. And I have peers on my own after Super Typhoon Haiyan. They dropped out of school because their parents cannot afford to send them to school anymore. And that is on top of the issue that whenever there is a disaster, when we go and evacuate to evacuation centers, there is even no toilet or comfort room for girls and boys. So everybody goes to the same comfort room. Everybody is in the same room, and there is no electricity and water in evacuation centers. So there was actually an increase of rape cases during disasters, and that is just massive. And climate change also affects our human rights, and women's rights, and child rights. So when we talk about climate change, we talk about also how it affects our right as a human being. A lot of our basic human rights are being deprived because of climatic disaster. And we have seen it. A lot of girls are being out of school because there is no school anymore, because it was washed out. There is no book, there is no school, there is no even teachers. There is lack of teachers in the communities because they have to flee, they have to migrate to safer places, and some of them don't go back to the communities anymore. So it really is increasing all of the gender inequalities that we have. Even like in the communities, there are more opportunities for boys to have access to education, to health, and to opportunities to job. It is always the women that is being left out. How much more in a crisis? How much more in a disaster? That is like increasingly massive. Like a lot of people are actually affected by it.
No, brilliant. And Clover?
Um, so we were at a session recently with Vanessa Nakate, who speaks so beautifully and so eloquently to the plight of climate justice and has very directly been impacted by environmental racism, racism in the media, literally being cropped out of photos, even here at COP26. And she shared a really powerful story, which is that a number of communities across the African continent who have been affected firsthand by drought and as a result are no longer able to rely on agriculture and growing their own food are forced into oftentimes giving away their young girls into child marriage to be able to support themselves and give them access to opportunity. And so we can see how the climate crisis is worsening existing inequalities. And to the points that both of these panelists have shared, the climate crisis is a humanitarian crisis. It's disproportionately affecting women, it's disproportionately affecting Black and brown communities, and even at COP26 we see how institutionalized barriers are keeping out folks from the global south, whether that's vaccine inequity, visa inequity, and so we continue to have conversations in closed door rooms where the people who have contributed the least and are going to be worst impacted or already being worst impacted by climate are not being present. And even if they are being handed the microphone on rare occasions, they're not actually being invited into decision-making spaces. And we see, of course, in the context of mental well-being as well, you know, much of our research around eco-anxiety looks at how young people are responding to the crisis. And disproportionately, according to most recent research, the young people who feel most despairing of the future are folks who live in the global south, who are already experiencing direct frontline impacts in places like Indonesia, in places like the Philippines. So this emerging generation is kind of giving up hope in a future that we were promised, because we see that the chances of being able to avoid climate collapse are fast dwindling.
If I can just jump in on that forced and child marriage point. Again, this is a key area of modern slavery. It is structural inequality for women and girls. But to talk about compounding crisis, last year in the COVID-19 pandemic, everyone, and we're still living in it, but in the thick of it, you know, everyone was affected by it, but really in very inequitable ways. And forced and child marriage, we know, increased throughout last year. In fact, Somalia tried to re-legalise child marriage last year for children as young as 8 years old. So this isn't a situation of who's doing good and who's doing bad. It's a situation of economic volatility and desperation. And the first thing to go in a situation of crisis is often the rights of women and girls. So when you see the crisis of the humanitarian crisis of modern slavery, the health crisis of this current pandemic, and the climate crisis, which we've all been living in for already a decade, women and girls every time are hit. And their education is taken off the table first. And I think another thing that was mentioned at that exceptional panel yesterday was that the climate crisis was, this is a little bit controversial, but it was very much created by men. It was created by white men, it was created by structural power, and the people who are at the front of solutions who really give me the greatest hope in the wake of this context are young women of colour. So I think we're talking about climate change, but we need to talk about systems change.
I guess even from a local perspective here in the UK, when we look at the connection between COVID-19 and the climate crisis in terms of the effect it has on health, especially in people of colour, because we know people of colour predominantly have got the dirtiest industries in their backyard, so as marginalised communities. And of course, one of the most tragic cases was that of Ella Kissi Deborah, who was a 9-year-old black girl who actually died as a cause of air pollution. So it's like, a lot of these areas are actually built by design. So it's like, in certain communities and cities, you've got your A neighbourhoods and your B neighbourhoods, and like, your nicer parts have got easily access to nice parks and everything get looked after more, whereas, so it's all basically by design. Like you said, it was created by the privileged few and those at the top, basically. Just to kind of touch and go a bit further, Grace, because I know you briefly touched upon eco-anxiety. I think it'd be really good, because I know it's probably still an emerging kind of theme, eco-anxiety, so it'd be really great if you can just explain what eco-anxiety is and basically how that's affecting communities and what can we do about it, basically.
So eco-anxiety relates to the rise of frustration, anger, despair, stress in response to the climate crisis. And we're seeing that more and more young people are kind of, as I mentioned earlier, giving up hope on the future. But by no means is this a new phenomenon. We've seen increased instances of mental health crises in frontline communities, communities in the aftermath of natural disasters. We've seen frontline communities who are disproportionately impacted. But I think eco-anxiety is often spoken about as a kind of condition and as a weakness that we should try and get away from. And everything that we do at Force of Nature is not only taking the conversation around mental health and climate mainstream, but destigmatizing these emotions. You go into spaces like COP, you go into spaces like the Blue Zone, everyone's, tight-necked in their suits, saying what's convenient, talking about this as if it's a problem that can be solved through technologies that won't exist for another 20 years. Ultimately, this is a spiritual crisis. It's a crisis of what it means to be human. It's about justice. It's about how we connect to one another. It's about our divorce from nature. It's about the fact that we live within systems that make it fundamentally difficult to do the right thing. And so eco-anxiety stems not only from the enormity of the crisis and the complexity of the crisis, but looking to people in historic seats of power and seeing inaction. As young people, we are raised to place our faith in institutions such as government, right? Such as our education system, big business. And yet we look around, we look at empty promises being made far enough into the future that they require no immediate action. We see companies investing more in greenwash and being seen to do the right thing rather than doing the right thing. We look at our education system. Here in the UK, climate change is pretty much a 1-hour geography lesson that happens per year, right? So young people are being failed and being betrayed when it comes to actually feeling equipped to take on these huge, overwhelming problems. So young people are right to feel eco-anxious, young people are right to feel angry, but critically, those feelings are such a force for change. And we've seen that in how young people have centered the climate conversation time and time again over the past few years.
Great. Just to kind of follow up on that, of course, we see a lot of young people who are always at the forefront of trying to fight for a better world and everything. And there'll be many young leaders basically watching and that are here today, also watching online. I guess what is the best way to deal with it, kind of thing, in all that? Of course, like you said, it can be used as a force for good, but of course, at times it can be an absolute burnout. Also, a lot of corporations also really exploit young people as well, young kind of climate activists at the same time as well. So what is, I guess, some practices, and God for it, especially like if you're a woman, if you're a person of colour, of course, it's all compounded, but what can those young leaders do, basically?
Yeah, this is an excellent question, one I'd love to pose to my fellow panelists as well. I think for a long time, I came into the climate space when I was 11 years old, and I felt enormous pressure to be inspired and empowered and positive and optimistic all the time. And it wasn't until the fires back home in Australia in 2019 where all of that collapsed in around me. I woke up every day crying. I would cry on my way to work, I'd cry in the shower, I'd cry in the middle of meetings, because every time I looked down at my phone, I saw the images rolling in of what was happening back home. I saw stories on Instagram of friends standing on the roofs of their homes, holding hoses, trying to beat back the flames. I saw the headlines that said 2 billion animals had been incinerated in this inferno, and I watched from afar as my country was engulfed in flames. And I grew up in a bubble of relative climate privilege. Climate change was something I read about in articles and watched in documentaries. And for the first time, the climate crisis was the direct loss of my culture and the very thing that inspired me to be an environmentalist in the first place. And I realized in those moments that I couldn't try to outrun the despair, yet nor should I, because that despair and that anxiety is proof of our humanity. The climate crisis, we're still facing it because we've gotten so good as a culture at numbing ourselves to the injustice, to numbing ourselves to the sacrifice of frontline communities, numbing ourselves to the pain of what we've done to our planet and the pain we continue to inflict upon ourselves. And so eco-anxiety, it's not something that we should try and fix. It's something that we should create space for and critically tune into and listen to, because when we listen to it, it gives us the power, the drive, the motivation to channel those difficult climate emotions into action, but also to connect with one another, to connect with folks in frontline communities for whom the climate crisis is already their lived experience. So for me, it's about creating space, and it's about channeling those feelings into action.
Brilliant, thank you. And I guess one of the things that kind of frustrates me is when they kind of focus on the rhetoric of the future, because as we know, it's happening right now, especially the devastating impacts having on many kind of countries in the global south. So I guess it's a lot of times these countries in the global south get ignored by those global powers. So what can, I guess, question to you, Marinelle, is these grassroots organizations in the global south, what role do they have and how can, I guess, they facilitate influence and power just to get their voices heard, basically, so they're not being ignored in the big stages?
Yeah, it's hard to ask that question, no? And it's also sad to say that why is it hard for us from the global south who are bearing the brunt of the climate crisis insist our demand to the world leaders? It feels like it has so much gap that sometimes they're so inaccessible. So we try to lobby with the government. We try to talk to them. Even now at this COP26, we, the youth, the CSOs, because there is no youth delegation coming from, no youth delegation with our PH delegation. So we try to lobby with them to meet us, to also hear our demands, because the Philippines has a national youth statement that we have crafted for 3 months. All of our delegates from the local conference of youth, we have drafted a national youth statement that actually outlines all the demands of the Filipino youth. But we want them to listen to that demands. But we have been trying to access them, and that's a reality. We have been trying to negotiate and debate with them and try to really give them our demands, but they are not receptive to that. So I think there are already initiatives from the ground to really try to work and partner with the government, but these politicians, they have their own political agenda. They have their own political biases. And no matter how much we try to say that please represent us in the negotiating table, please be our voice in the negotiating table, because we are not there to tell the world leaders that, hey, climate change is happening, it is killing our loved ones, it is killing our livelihood, it is washing away our community. What are you doing for us? What can you do for us? Because we are already at the front line. And lucky for those people who are telling that climate change will happen in the future and they don't want that there will be flood in their houses. They don't want that their houses will be washed out. They don't want that time will come that there is no food anymore. Lucky for them to be thinking that climate change still happen in 5 or 10 years, because climate change is happening now in our country and we are living by it every day of our lives. And yet our leaders fail to recognize that our loved ones are, perishing, are dead because of their inaction. And as much as we want to share this story, if our leaders will not do something with that story, that is put in waste. And this is really with the eco-anxiety, actually, because I have been feeling, we all know that that climate change is being fueled by human behavior, human lifestyle, or the big corporations, actually. But seeing that in the IPCC report has so many emotions that we all know that we're fueling climate change. But seeing that at the IPCC report gives so much emotion, and we have to acknowledge those emotions. We have to acknowledge that it's fine to be sad. It's fine to cry. It's fine to say that I am not okay, that the world is not okay, that I am not okay, that my neighbor don't have any food at the next day because they are trying to survive another disaster. I am not okay with that, and I am not okay with the system. And no one is is trying to push you that you should be okay to next week, or you should be okay next month. You just have to go with your own pacing, because climate justice fight is a very long fight. And if we will be burned out now, who will fight for us? Who will try to surface these struggles at the ground? And yeah, I think there's just so many, and I really thank you for saying that. It's so how we could turn that emotion into action. How we could try to amplify more the voices of the grassroots, the voices on the ground, the struggles on the ground, because it's so ironic that I was in COP25 doing the same thing. I was sharing my story, and then my community was hit again by another disaster. I wasn't able to contact my family for 3 days, and on the Christmas Eve, on December 24 at night, they were literally homeless because of another typhoon again. So we've been trying to retell our story, and it's like 5 years now, almost 8 years after Haiyan, yet we don't have any result.
Honestly, thank you so much for sharing. I think as much as we are in a climate crisis, we're also in a crisis of empathy more than anything else, and as well. And it's one thing I just would love to kind of just for you just to kind of touch upon. Of course, you kind of shared it in terms of what's happening in the Philippines and elsewhere, but how is the solidarity? Like, for example, do you feel like, is there like your organization working with organizations in other islands or other countries in the global south? Is there, how was basically that being in terms of that solidarity? And of course, solidarity is important, but are you seeing actions coming from that as well?
Yeah, I've been seeing a lot of partnership from youth from different countries, but there is just, the idea that an organization, a youth organization, or any organization from the global north, partnering with an organization from the global south, there's always a connotation that the organization from the global north is helping the global south. Where it should be like a partnership, not making us a beneficiary, because we are not just victims, we could also play a part in the solution. And that is just one thing that I want to shift the focus, because it's always I always hear that, oh, we are helping this organization from the global south, when in fact it's partnership. You should have partnership with organization from the global south, because they could make also a difference, and you could help, you could each other help alongside with all your campaigns and amplifying climate justice campaigns and all the campaigns that you have. Right.
Definitely. I think there's always an element of the white savior complex of basically just being like, we know the answers, which is not true, basically. But thank you so much. Honestly, thank you so much for sharing. I think that's why even having you here on this platform is really, really important. So thanks for all that you do. Just coming over to you, Grace. I know you briefly kind of just touched upon modern slavery and the kind of links that it has with the climate crisis. But how are you finding this COP26? Are you finding that it is being on the agenda? Are you... what are your hopes in terms of raising the agenda of the intersection of modern slavery and climate within this COP26?
Yeah, it's not on the agenda. And I think that, right now, and I'm grateful for it, the subject specifically of climate change and inaction is trending, but the climate crisis, as I said, is intersecting crisis. And as long as things keep being treated in isolation, we will continue to be gaslit by global leaders. And I think that is the right word. We are being gaslit. Don't be anxious, but then we don't see what's being done. And, I wasn't going to talk about Australia, but because you mentioned the fires, Australia started 2020 literally choking on government inaction. And I think it was the first time for many people they felt the effects of crisis. Australia does have extreme weather, but the effects of real out of control crisis. People standing on beaches, unsure if boats would be able to get to them, to get them away. But Australia is also an incredibly powerful and privileged country. So what followed the fires, then came drought, then extreme flooding. It was biblical. It was one disaster after another. And as horrific as that is for the communities that were hit, and it was lower socioeconomic communities that were hit harder and faster, we do have government systems in place that can protect people to an extent. We do have, a National Guard service that can get people out and evacuate them. That is already, for most people, the worst they can imagine this looks like, and it's the best case scenario for most of the world. The reality is that ability to respond in crisis, we see it in the US all the time. Even people in the US, the wealthiest country in the world, the vulnerable or structurally disadvantaged, rather, communities there, they still suffer the most in a country that should be able to protect everyone. And these are tiny little case studies of what's going to happen around the world. The intersection between modern slavery and crisis is about structural inequality. And, I think that for me, the intersection on individual action versus the call for systems change is a really powerful one, because it can feel really crushing, when Vanessa Nakate, other frontline climate activists, when world leaders say to you, you're really inspiring and you guys will solve this, because basically that's just like, good luck, see ya, we've made our money, we've made our time, and peace, good luck, guys. And they don't want to be inspiring, they want a seat at the table. Yeah. They don't want to be inspiring and used as an icon waved from a flag. They want to be able to fight for policy, and communities with lived experience are always going to have the greatest solutions to these problems. And as long as they're on the outside and conversations like this are happening outside of the blue zone, what are we doing here? Every world leader should be made to listen to what has been said on this panel today, and they're not. They all just talk to each other. We're not going to get a different result by doing the same thing. So for me, an immediate solution is around radical transparency on supply chains. Only 6% of global supply chains are transparent. So for all the commitments and pledges in the world, it doesn't mean anything if the public can't actually see what's going on. And any company that's willing to harm another human being will always destroy the natural environment, and vice versa. So we need to fight for people and planet in coordination. We need to ask all companies to do fairly basic things like pay a minimum living wage, which, by the way, check out the sponsors. They don't necessarily do that here. That is not a golden standard to aspire to. It should be the baseline standard. And as I said, I think intersecting crisis and basic corporate accountability, it has to come with both. It has to be publicly measured, and it has to be something that we see as a make or break. And as consumers, we do have power over that, but I think it's both individual action and calling for systems change. I don't think it's one versus the other. I think those with the most power and influence should foot the greatest responsibility on changing this, but I fundamentally do believe that what each of us does matters, and there's nothing that scares shareholders more than people trying to boycott a company over something. And what I would love to see is true intersectional environmentalism, where we fight for human rights as well as climate justice, where we fight as feminists for the women who make our clothes, because they're young women of colour at the front of supply chains. And when we respond to a pandemic, a lot of that PPE was made by people living in modern slavery. A lot of that PPE is going to end up back in the ocean. We take one step forward and we take 3 steps back. And if our systems of sustainability are so fragile that we ban plastic straws in 30 countries and then we have to bring them back the second that we have a health crisis, and this health crisis has been horrific, but it could have been a lot worse. The effects of this pandemic we've gone through, we know there's been other pandemics and there will likely be more to come. So how do we build systems that are actually resilient to change and compounding crisis? Because that's what our future is going to be looking at. And to me, resilience comes from frontline communities. Resilience comes from building systems from the ground up rather than the top down.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Just a quick reminder to everyone to please send in your questions via the Slido method, which apparently is somewhere on the screen. But just, I guess, in terms of community and just community mobilizing in itself, we kind of often hear, well, these communities are already struggling with lots of other things. It's hard to engage them or mobilize them, because of course we know the importance of mobilizing these communities and making sure that we mobilize them to take action within their communities within the elected representatives. So it's, I guess to kind of give you one example, like in Sheffield, there was a community that necessarily weren't engaged in the climate conversation, but yet they understood the impact that the climate, the pollution was having in their community. So a lot of parents kind of got together to really stop idling cars outside schools, for example, because, for example, there was actually even a school that had to close down due to really bad air pollution. So, of course, parents, everyone cared about their children's health, whatever, and people really mobilized along that, and I guess through that actions, people kind of like education took place and everything. But I guess I'd be really interested in terms of your experience in your line of work. Have any of you guys come across any kind of really good examples of actually communities mobilizing around a specific issue, or kind of like certain practices that we can hopefully kind of take away from, or just even just shedding some great achievements?
Well, being a community organizer, I have seen a lot of initiatives on the ground already, and I really like what Grace has said. Like in the communities, big organizations and our leaders would go there and tell us what to do, and I think that's not okay. I think that when we decide for the community, when we make project for the community, it is always important to engage with them, to have consultation, and to make them involved in the planning, implementation, and post-implementation of that project. Because you cannot just go to the community and say, do this and do that, because that will solve your problem. No, because those communities, they already have projects on the ground, they already have their own initiatives on the ground. And what they need is support from the government and big organizations to make those initiatives sustainable. And one thing, one project that really struck me when I was in a community was that because this community don't have any, the community don't have any source of water, they made their own water reservoir. They made their own water harvesting equipment. And that is just from containers that they could just get in their own neighborhood. Because the government just, like there is just one truck that goes to the community, gives water, and then the other truck would go again the next day. So it was the initiative of the community to make this harvesting rainwater and filter it and make it and use it for their own household use and even for drinking if they boil it. So, like, how can the government try to replicate that, support that initiative, so that the community would be and would live independently? Because that's already their initiative there, and that is more sustainable because the sense of ownership of the community is there.
Brilliant, thank you. And I think one thing that kind of like theme that kind of comes out of everything that you've been saying is collaboration, because the whole point is like, we've heard the kind of slogan of nothing about us without us kind of thing, because sadly you do kind of see government policymakers or just government making policies without actually creating those policies with those on the forefront kind of thing. So it's kind of begs the question, who are you kind of working for more than anything else? But I just want to briefly introduce our other lovely panelist, Inesa Umuhozo Grace. Can you please join me in giving her a massive welcome to the stage? Inez, thank you so much for joining us. I just kind of thought it'd be really good if you can just give a very brief introduction in terms of who you are, the work that you're kind of doing. And of course, we've been talking a lot about mobilizing communities, especially people of color, women in general. So anything, introduce yourself, and anything like you want to kind of share would be greatly appreciated.
Thank you so much. I will start by saying I'm so sorry for being so late. I just got lost in this beautiful city with the help of Google Maps. So, as you said, my name is Inesa, and I present myself as an ecofeminist, first of all, because I do believe that whatever wrong we did to our planet, we are able to recover back. That's one of the ecosystem. And the feminist is just that we all have the power to lead, regardless of the gender. So a brief introduction. I am from Rwanda. It's a small country, but beautiful, located in Africa. You should visit if you get the time. And my work really focuses on climate justice, because we want to do our best in taking action on the ground and also to create hope. So I started my first initiative in 2017, which is the Green Fighter, and our purpose is to increase an active youth participation in the creation of the protection of environment through youth-driven action. And then in 2020, me and my colleague, we started what is called the Loss and Damage Youth Coalition, which is a global coalition of the youth to pressure global leaders to take action in addressing loss and damage. We all know, based on the recent IPCC report, that our planet is in the red zone. And it's not a matter of pointing fingers on who did more or who did less, because now we all need to create what we can call a global solidarity, because that's the only way we are going to survive. Because each moment we pass without taking action, our biodiversity is at risk, our life is at risk, and the most painful truth is that those who did less to contribute to the greenhouse gas emission causing the climate change are at the front line, and there's no such a way or such a thing as an international mechanism that is driven to make them recover better and faster. And in 2020, with the event happening in Germany, we found that some countries do have some mechanisms to respond back, but a developed country like mine in Rwanda, when we are facing flooding, washing away most of our development, there's no such a thing that is available for us to recover. So basically, it is our GDP that is being used, and that's is a form of injustice, and it needs to be ending with this generation. And everyone, wherever you are located, we all have a part to play. That would be what I would say, and I will keep it short because I know I'm late.
Thank you so much, Inez. Just going to go through some questions. I guess it's a massive privilege for all of us to kind of be actually here in Glasgow and actually to be able to practice the work that we're doing. So we've got a question from an anonymous person that kind of asks, how have you had to deal with any personal threats or challenges for pursuing your respective work? In my country, in Bolivia, it is dangerous to do this work. And of course, we know, sadly, there's been many cases where climate activists have actually been murdered in themselves for actually standing up to injustice happening in their community. So any of you guys in the panel, if you kind of want to share in terms of like your experiences, and go for it.
Yeah, I have personal experience about that. And sadly, in 2019, the Philippines was the third deadliest country to be an environmentalist. And in 2020, it was the second. We kind of had a progress there. But yeah, it's just so sad to have. I had friends who were killed, who were red tagged, and who were killed. And just in 2019 alone, we had 200 plus killings of environmentalists. And last year in February, I have been red tagged. And what is devastating about this experience is that it is not just about your safety that you're worried about. It is also the safety of your family, because I don't know if I can say this, but there is a surveillance in the community that goes into the community and asks about your whereabouts, and then they would ask, where is your parents and your family, and where do you live? And that is actually very scary in the sense that my family is also threatened, not just me, and intimidated. So, but I guess I'm okay now since I am here already. It's like a year after I am still here sharing with you my story. But that is not something that I should like be happy about, because there are still a lot of environmental advocates who are still struggling with their lives, risking their lives, trying to fight for their rights to a safe environment. And it is like a basic human right. All of us has that same human right to be living in a safe environment, to have shelter, to have clothing, to have food, to be cared of, to be able to go to school. But those basic human rights that we enjoy are not being enjoyed by the people in the front line. And on top of that, they are being threatened. On top of that, they are being killed.
Exactly. I know you need to go, and can I ask one quick question? Just is that okay?
Yeah.
Just very quick. We've got a question regarding the media, because of course the media plays a really important role, kind of thing. I'm trying to also just link it to, I guess, eco-anxiety, because a lot of the time the news can be turn to a lot of doom and gloom at times. So it's what role has the media got basically in terms of contributing to eco-anxiety?
Yeah, well, I just want to say, first off, thank you for sharing. It's very humbling, you know, as an activist who lives in a place like London, I think we can forget that it is a privilege to be an activist in these kind of spaces and to be able to show up, and for the worst of it to be burnout, right, and anxiety and despair, when in fact there are so many environmentalists we're not hearing about, so many social justice activists for whom it is a very direct threat to their livelihoods and their lives. So for one, the media is not reporting on any of that. We're not hearing frontline struggle, we're not hearing frontline experiences. But in the broader conversation around climate, I mean, so much of it is incredibly apocalyptic, right? And you spoke to this as well. You know, we're kind of used to talking about the global south through the lens of like victimization, and the global south holds so much knowledge, wisdom, experience. And so for me, what I want to see more from the media is not just the apocalyptic kind of doomsday images, which inevitably shut us down in the face of this crisis. We need to be hearing of the people on the front lines who are delivering solutions today. It's very convenient for politicians to say, well, there's, you know, this techno-utopian solution, carbon sequestration technology that will exist in 20 years and be a great market opportunity, right? That's all very convenient, but we have the solutions today. They don't want to acknowledge that, but if we give platform to the people who are leading them right now, we can actually see those solutions, we can feel empowered by them, and we can begin to reimagine a future that isn't just this dystopian image that is so present in all of our minds. That alternative future is possible, but we have to have the courage to imagine it, and we have to have the courage to sit in that future today.
Definitely. And thank you very much. Really, really appreciate your time, Clover. Thank you for joining us. And I guess, thank you. And just wanted to, I guess, go to Grace and Inesa, if you guys, in terms of how can how can the media better support climate justice? And as well, if you guys want to share any of your experiences as well, that'd be really, really grateful.
So I'm starting.
So basically, and just one of the questions was how can the media better support climate justice?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So the first step for the media to support is share the right information with the community, because most of the time the access to information is limited, especially in the global south. So we need the media to speak the truth and let everyone knows that we are at risk, and stop picturing that when, for example, a country is pledging a certain amount of money for climate justice, let the media not assume that the money will be directly reaching the frontline community. So they will be needing to increase the level of knowing exactly the certain barriers that we are facing in accessing those kind of support on the ground, and then share around so that we can all pressure our global leaders with one unique voice. That would be what I will share.
Yeah, and off the back of that completely, of one voice, you know, the media loves to report on activists' anger and not their excellence. And as long as we do that, we just look like polarizing, angry, emotional young people, when actually there are some really solid solutions coming from young people at the coalface of the climate crisis. And honestly, if I see one more media outlet cut Vanessa Nakate out of a photo when she stands with Greta, I and my organisation will never work with them again. It is ridiculous that we keep that 2 years on from her first getting cut out of Davos, where she famously said, you're not cutting out a person, you're cutting out a continent, and you're doing it very purposefully. And once again at COP this week, she is cut out of the photos. It is mind-blowing, it is unacceptable, it is racist, it is problematic, and as long as anyone is cut out and there isn't a unified voice, we will not succeed. And I'm sure that for Greta, who is always put at the centre, that is the last thing that she wants as well. And it's, you cut between this space where absolutely we need our issues to be on the agenda, but sometimes the media puts you in a position of at what cost? And you know, we need to have intersectional solutions to intersectional problems. So, yeah, if the media could just stop cutting out people who are essential to the solution, that'd be great.
Brilliant. Just a quick question, Inesa, and I'd love to kind of know in terms of your experience working with global climate organizations, would that be like, in general, like, have you feel like as if like, because one of the things we kind of touched upon earlier on is that there can always be a lot of pandering to a lot of kind of youth climate activists and stuff like that. But how's your experience been working with businesses and climate organizations?
So the first biggest challenges was to picture youth inclusion as an add value, because most of the time when you enter the room and then, as you said, you are like, we have a solution to present as youth. If you are not having challenge based on your gender, is now the age. So it's really hard to be pictured as an active stakeholders. But if I can share the experience of my team, what we did is that we stepped a little bit back because we were like threatened of the level of inequality that was existing in the global system. And we focus on doing what we know to do better, which is shaping our voice and strategically enhance our capacity. And now we are having partners around the world who are aiming to increase us to understand, first of all, the policy, because there's no way we are going to have a change if the youth are not at the center in the policy-making decision, because we all know that this kind of inaction is all backed up with the policy, and it's more than enough that everyone is old in the room. So we need to have like a new generation of climate leaders who are young people who understand the process and who can hold the leaders accountable using their own languages, because that's one thing that is missing. And after we understood that one, we also draw back to be close to the community by understanding their concern and sharing their voices in a way that will make sense to the leaders. So, for example, in the Loss and Damage Youth Coalition, we have a storytelling component where we collect the experience of the frontline youth in loss and damage, and then we use information received to create open letters with specific demand to global leaders. So we shared, for example, one to the USA, to the EU, and now we have our COP26 statement. And if you can read to the statement, you can find it's both what the civil society is willing to see and also both what the policy or the political change should look like. So that's how we pictured, and we are still going. It's a very challenging road, but it's not a hopeless one because we have hope.
Brilliant, thank you very much. And just coming to you, Marinelle, and we just got a question. And there's many young people who are, of course, really inspired by the works that yourself do and so many other kind of amazing climate activists that are some are here at COP, some unfortunately, due to its inaccessibility, aren't here at COP. Who have obviously, of course, inspiring or continue inspiring young people. And this person can ask, what piece of advice would you have for a young leader when trying to mobilize their own communities for the first time?
That's a really nice question, because our organization actually mentors young organizations on how they could like implement, or how they could start their own advocacy and their own organization. And I always say this in every interview and every speaking engagement that I have: do not ever underestimate your power to make a change. Because I was just a young girl from a very remote community in the Philippines. I didn't even know that someone from COP21 would be listening to my story when I spoke at the opening of COP21 in Paris. This was the only time that I thought, oh, people could actually listen to my story. And never ever underestimate that power within you to make change happen. Because that passion is it can influence people, you know. It can influence your family, your community to do the same. And you always have to go back to why you are even doing it, to why you are there. You have to go back the reason why you are fighting for climate justice. And I always say that the young generation today have creative minds to actually put on solutions, to give solutions to our leaders. If there will just be a platform for them to be in the decision-making processes. And I have to say this, I was in pre-COP in Milan last September, and we drafted the Global Youth Statement with COI just before COP26. And it is just so sad that in the day 2 of COP26, we saw the manifesto, the Youth for Climate Manifesto and the Global Youth Statement in the trash bin in the blue zone. That is kind of like also shows how our leaders are just making these events to be like a tokenistic event. Like they're saying they're listening to us, they're listening to the communities, they're listening to the youth. But are we there at the decision-making processes when they decide what's best for the communities, what's best for the planet? Are they even considering all the demands that we have given them, all the demands that we have? But that should not discourage our young leaders of today to stop fighting. That should not discourage them to fight for climate justice, because that should actually motivate them to do more. Because it is sad that we have still to insist our voices. It is sad, it is a sad reality, but we have to make it happen, because we have to make these leaders listen to us and consider our demands, because we're done with just you listening to us. We want you to consider our demands.
Thank you very much. And one thing I always try to kind of get across is that everything that we see in the system that we were born into, that we're kind of living in, was created by somebody. Somebody decided things should be this way. So it's really important for young people to kind of realize things can change. We just don't have to accept this as a status quo. Just a question coming over to you, Grace, which we received from Jones in South Africa, asks, Grace, what advice can you give about advocating for improved government policies on a national and international level? What learnings can be applied to climate?
I think from a legislative perspective on modern slavery, part of what Walk Free does is work towards those shifts and changes. I don't think government is the be-all and the end-all, but I think unless there is adequate legislation, we're all working outside of a system. So in the UK and in Australia, we have something called a Modern Slavery Act. It looks at transparency and global supply chains. It's fine, it could be better, but something that I had the privilege of looking at this year, and that does actually make me feel a bit excited, is the human rights due diligence laws that are coming into play in Germany and hopefully across the EU. They look at proactive measures that companies must take to mitigate harm to people and planet. So it's not a reactive response to, oh, we found slavery, we ruined a bunch of kids' lives and we burnt down the rainforest in the process. It's actually, if you're going to do business in that area, you need to understand the vulnerability to both and the responsibility and public accountability you have as a company to create environments of protection and to create environments that prevent harm. So I think in the globalised world that we live in, we know that supply chains are as complex as they've ever been. They are far-reaching, and I think that for the G20 especially, the world's most powerful, the world's wealthiest nations, their supply chains need to be crystal freaking clear. Because when we look at the transatlantic slave trade, and I had the privilege of being in Ghana earlier this year working with the interfaith community of West Africa, we went to Elmina, where there still stands the Elmina slave castle. It is a scar on the coastline of that country. And I literally walked through the cells where people were held. And it's such this horrifying legacy. People look back and say, never again, how could that happen? But the awful reality is that those historical industries of discrimination, inequality, and injustice, they still are here with us today. Sugar, tobacco, cocoa, coffee. We know that they're all still there, and where once people were shipped across the seas as commodities, now commodities are shipped across the seas, still made by people living in modern slavery. So at the very least, we need due diligence laws that mandate transparency. As I said earlier, only 6% of global supply chains are transparent, and that's just not good enough. You can't measure what you can't manage, and we need proactive due diligence laws that cover people and planet together.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. So we're nearly going to wrap it up. So I just kind of thought I'd give you a last opportunity to our panelists, 30 seconds, 20 seconds. And Marinelle, if you kind of just want to kind of leave us with anything, and then I'll come to you, Grace, and then we'll finish it with Inesa.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much for listening to the story of my community. There are still a lot of grassroots climate activists in the Philippines and in vulnerable communities who feel that they are not heard in in the global climate justice movement. And we are running this campaign, and if you want to support that campaign, it is in my bio in my Instagram. You can just look me up in the Instagram. If you can support that campaign, it will really do so much for the grassroots climate activists who you don't even hear in conferences like this one or in interviews like this one. We have to amplify their voices. We have to make sure that they are also heard, and their initiatives on the ground will also be supported. Thank you so much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Grace?
We need to treat crises not in isolation, but as interconnected issues that governments and business leaders need to be held to account on.
Thank you very much. And last but not least, Inesa?
Thank you so much. So my last one will be, please, everyone, you can learn from my country leadership style, because not only youth are the center in deciding, but we also are present on international level, and it will be such a major game changer if youth, as my colleague said, the activists from the outside can also be translated in the inside of the decision-making process, because that will be the only one way to end the tokenistic approach that my colleague mentioned, and it will be also the only way that each and everyone in the room can know that we all have a voice, and that voice can demand climate justice. And currently, the only way to do it is having a loss and damage finance now at COP26.
Amen.
I'd like to just say a massive thank you to everybody who's joining us online from around the world. Thank you. And to everybody joining us here today, and to the wonderful team of One Young World and Extreme. And please give my wonderful panelists one last massive round of applause.